Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Tom and today I would like to compare two graphics cards. We have a Nvidia GTX 970 right here, which I bought for about 350 to 360 euros in late 2014. And we have an Rx Vega 56 also from ASUS right here, which I bought very recently for about the same price. Today I want to answer a couple of questions. First of all, how much faster is this new Vega compared to the old GTX 970? Secondly, because this is also sort of AMD versus Nvidia, I would like to show what are the differences in the two softwares, so the softwares that you get with the graphics drivers. And lastly, if you already have a 970, is it worth upgrading to a Vega 56 now? Is it worth the money? That's what we're trying to find out today. Let's start with some performance tests. Both cards are being tested in my main system, which has an AMD Ryzen 7 2700X with Precision Boost Overdrive enabled, as well as 32 GB of G.Skill RAM at 3000 MHz. In Rise of the Tomb Raider, the GTX 970 averaged 65.1 FPS with a 1% low of 37.3 FPS. That said, even though the 1% low is fairly low, it did still feel very playable. However, the Vega 56 beat it by nearly 50%, averaging at 97.4 FPS with a 1% low of 54.7 FPS. So you could probably play this at 1440p with the Vega 56. However, in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the GTX 970 only managed to average 44.7 FPS at 1080p, and the 1% low FPS was at 31.6, so this was barely playable. It did really feel pretty choppy, and it would certainly benefit from lowering the settings. In this game, the GTX 970 gets annihilated by the Vega 56. That averages 81.8 FPS with a 1% low of 54.3. That's an 83% increase. Moving on to GTA 5, or rather GTA Online. That said, I did actively choose an area where usually there aren't many people, and I was lucky that in both runs there were no people around. So the GTX 970 averaged 64.3 FPS, which is very respectable, and the 1% low was at 46.2, which is entirely playable. The Vega 56, on the other hand, averaged 90.3 FPS with a 1% low of 17.8 FPS, so that is a 40% increase in average FPS in favor of the Vega 56. In Forza Horizon 4, I had to use the in-game's own benchmark tool, and I could not record the 1% lows with MSI Afterburner because the game doesn't launch if you have MSI Afterburner running. That said, we still have the average FPS and a rough guess what the 1% lows would be based on the single minimal frame rate that the game showed. The average frame rate for the GTX 970 was 62 FPS on the dot, and the 1% low was around 53 FPS because the lowest frame rate it found was 51.4. The Vega 56 absolutely demolishes the GTX 970 in this game, averaging at 114.3 FPS with a 1% low of about 105. That's an 84% increase in average frame rate. You may already know that Fortnite is much better optimized for Nvidia hardware than for AMD graphics cards. In Fortnite, we see the 970 averaging at 78.8 FPS and with a 1% low of 53.9 FPS. And that 1% low is actually better than the Vega 56's 47.9, but the Vega is overall 24.7% faster, averaging at 98.3. That being said, as we know, Fortnite favors Nvidia cards, and as a result, the performance difference here isn't as large as you would expect. Things change in Apex Legends, however. Here the GTX 970 only manages to average 68.3 FPS with a 1% low of 47.2. This means that the Vega absolutely annihilates it, averaging at 125 FPS with a 1% low of 83.4. That's an 83% increase. The Witcher 3 is notoriously demanding on the GPU, and here we see the GTX 970 really struggle. It only manages to average 43 FPS with a 1% low of 37.4, whereas the Vega 56 averages 76 FPS and with 46 FPS in the 1% lows. That's an increase of 76.4%. Now, interestingly, if you leave everything on Ultra and just decrease the foliage render distance from Ultra to High, then the 970 averages 52.1 FPS, which is 9.1 FPS increase, and makes this game pretty playable with this card. And with the same settings, the Vega, for comparison, averages 88.5 FPS. In Far Cry New Dawn, the in-game benchmark which I've used seems to be mostly CPU bound. The 970 averages 61.2 FPS here with 1% low of 44.1, and the Vega averages 77.4 FPS with a 1% low of 53.4. But that being said, with both cards, for the majority of the duration of this in-game benchmark, the FPS were below 60 and around 50, indicating that we're dealing with a CPU bottleneck here. This being said, the in-game benchmark does have a short 5 or 6 second sequence that is apparently more GPU intensive, and here we see the FPS for both GPUs rising. For the 970, the FPS peaks at 77, and for the Vega it peaks at 117. In Wreckfest, with 23 AI cars, so for a total of 24 cars, we see a CPU bottleneck. The FPS between the two cards were basically interchangeable, with maybe a slight 1% low advantage for the Vega, but mostly the average FPS were completely within margin of error. The same actually also happened because when I, out of curiosity, tested with just 7 AIs for 8 cars in total. Then we saw an average FPS of 105 FPS with both cards, but again, it seems that we're CPU limited. And before we move on to some synthetic benchmarks, Mafia 3, here the GTX 970 averaged 52.7 FPS with a 1% low of 39 FPS, which is playable but not the best experience. And the Vega 56 averaged at 74.1 FPS with a 1% low of 43.2. So not 100% consistent, but on average the Vega was faster by 40.6%. In 3D Mark Time Spy, the GTX 970 scored 3,585 points, GPU score that is, with 23.29 FPS average in the first graphics test and 20.61 FPS average in the second graphics test. The Vega 56, on the other hand, scored 6,729 graphics score, averaging at 46.58 FPS in the first graphics test and 36.70 FPS in the second graphics test. The score is 87.7% higher than the one on the GTX 970. And finally, 3D Mark Firestrike. Here the GTX 970 managed to score 11,368 graphics points, averaging 54.4 FPS in the first graphics test and 45.3 FPS in the second graphics test. The Vega 56 scored 21,555 points in the same test, averaging 104.5 FPS in the first graphics test and 85 FPS in the second graphics test. The score on the Vega 56 was 89.6% higher, than on the GTX 970. With that said, let's look at the softwares. With the Nvidia drivers, you get two softwares. The first is called the GeForce Experience. This is the home screen where you can see a bunch of your games, though by far not all of them. And what you can do here is you can launch them directly through the software, and you can view details, and you will see current and optimal settings. So because I've benchmarked this game earlier, everything's on high. You can set optimize, and then it'll apply these quote-unquote optimal settings because it tries to optimize the games in such a way that you will be running at a constant 60 FPS plus. So for more demanding games, for example, let's say, where is it? Doesn't, yeah, it does see Shadow of the Tomb Raider, yeah. Everything on low or off is what it suggests for Shadow of the Tomb Raider. What else is here? You can launch the games directly through the software, as I've said. You can go to drivers, and you can check for driver updates, and then it'll check for updates, and either say you have the latest GeForce driver, or it'll appear right here where my mouse cursor is. And you can also go to settings. Here you can see your driver version. You can toggle on or off the in-game overlay, and you have your system specs here. Game optimization, game stream using Nvidia Shield. So this is basically Shadowplay 2.0. Virtual reality can be enabled here. You can view your GeForce account, which is something you have to create in order to use the software. You can manually search for games that you want to optimize through the software, although it doesn't really do anything other than change the settings that you could change in-game anyway. And lastly, here's Nvidia Shield, and interestingly, it doesn't actually find any games here. Okay. So the second Nvidia software is the Nvidia control panel. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, this is how it looks. We're at the latest driver version, and this still looks like it came from Windows 95. Now, technically, it has pretty much anything. So also, sorry for this being in German. I didn't find a way of setting this to English without setting my OS to English. So in any case, it has like FXAA, all these sort of things, 3D settings. You can also set the preset to quality or performance. You can change your resolutions, your colors, and somewhere in here, although I'm not quite sure where, you can enable what is called a DSR, Dynamic Super Resolution. And what it does is it allows you to, like for example, if you have a 1080p panel, you can have the image being rendered in 1440p, but then scaled down to fit your 1080p display, so you can get sharper textures. That's somewhere in here. And also somewhere in here, although I can't really find that either, is Nvidia's version of AMD Affinity. So that's that allows you to there's DSR. It's right there. Somewhere in here as well is also the ability to merge multiple displays into one larger display wall, and yeah, that is basically AMD's Affinity. As far as AMD goes, there's only one software with their drivers in its Radeon settings. And immediately this looks a lot cleaner and a lot more modern than NVIDIA's software, especially the NVIDIA control panel. Like in GeForce Experience, you have a gaming tab right here, where you can see your games. Just like in the NVIDIA software, you can launch the game from here. You can also remove one of these profiles if you've made some changes and you messed things up. You can just remove it and re-add the game by clicking here. If you actually go into one of these games, like GTA 5, for example, you can see your anti-aliasing modes, the texture filtering, what sort of vertical refresh you want, display scaling, launch of AMD Affinity, which is down here. So yeah, this is a quick setup. I'm not going to do this now because it's going to mess with my two monitors. It's going to merge them together, and I don't want that for the purpose of this video right now. I prefer working with two separate monitors. But anyway, if you have two or more monitors running off of one graphics card, you can merge them together into one larger display wall. That goes up to 6 monitors from one graphics card. This does not work if the monitors are connected to separate graphics cards. So for example, if you have 6 monitors total, but across 2 graphics cards, then it won't work. It'll only take the monitors from the primary graphics card. In display, you have pretty much anything that you can change about your display panels. You can activate FreeSync, virtual super resolution, which is basically what Nvidia's dynamic super resolution or DSR is. It renders the image in a higher resolution and then downscales it to a monitor's native resolution. It's just for some sharper image quality. You can change color depth, the pixel format. The HDMI scaling can situationally be useful if you ever run into the situation where you connect a new monitor with HDMI and the scale of the image that it produces is too large or too small. Then you can adjust this slider and you can correct it that way. You can also make a custom resolution, but it's usually a little bit too complicated. Identify basically checks for new displays. That doesn't really make much sense here because I only have 2 monitors and they're both shown here. Color, you can change the brightness, hue, contrast, saturation, and also the color temperature. You can change that for each of your monitors individually. And you can also clone one monitor onto the other one. This is all things that I'm sure the Nvidia control panel has somewhere, but it's just a mess. You can't find anything. Connect is you can connect your device to other devices of yours that also have Radeon settings, so you can like synchronize the settings or whatnot. But I don't have any other device with a Radeon graphics card installed. Relive is pretty good. It is a streaming and recording software similar to Nvidia, well, Shadowplay or Shield, I guess it's called now. But it does offer more features than Nvidia Shield does. So for example, save in-game replay hotkey. So when you're recording, you can make instant replays and you can save those with like as separate clips, which is pretty cool. What else you can do is, I'm not sure where this is in here, but you can make, yeah, there it is. You can make GIFs out of some of those clips that you make while with the instant replay feature. You can do game and VR streaming, and this is again something that Nvidia doesn't have. If you enable this, what you need to do is you need to install AMD Link on your phone. For example, your Android phone or your iOS phone if you have a relatively recent build. And then you can stream the game that you're playing on the PC onto your phone. So, for example, the PC is running the game. It's so the game is running with the resources from the PC, but it is streamed to your phone, so you can look at the game and even control it if you pair something like a Bluetooth controller to it. So that's pretty neat. Live streaming, obviously, YouTube, Twitch, what have you. Recording settings are here. One more thing I wanted to show you while we're doing is just these are just basically presets for different colors, color shades, and saturations and whatnot. But something else I wanted to show you is Wattman. That is also something that Nvidia doesn't have an equivalent for. You can find global Wattman settings here in the gaming tab, and this warning actually said that Wattman is technically overclocking if you change the core clocks or memory clocks. So do keep that in mind, that if something goes wrong, you're on your own. And on Vega cards, so Vega 56, Vega 64, and Radeon 7, you have these presets here. You can use balanced turbo, which is basically a pre-overclock. You can use custom, so you can make your own changes. You can do that. You can enter values manually into these fields, depending on how fast you want the clock speeds to be in any given stage. Just going to leave this at auto now. You can also have, only on the Vega cards, you have these buttons here for auto undervolt, overclock, or overclock memory. You have this right here, the GPU frequencies is there for any Radeon graphics card that supports the current drivers. Same for the fan controls. We can just do this here and then move these left or right depending on what temperature it should activate at, up or down depending on how much the fans should be active. Just going to leave it in auto for now. And here's the memory speed. Now what you can do is you can save a profile and then apply, and then if it goes wrong, you can reset. Or alternatively, if you've saved one profile and it works, and then you want to overclock a little bit higher and that fails, you can reset and load the profile that you had previously saved and which was working. Pretty cool, huh? Okay, and lastly, what I wanted to show you is performance monitoring. Technically, you can already see the GPU activity clocks and temperatures here, but the performance monitoring is still pretty damn cool. You can bring up this little overlay with Control-Shift-O, and with these settings, you can adjust what you want to see. So the core clock, the memory clock, the temperature, how much power it's drawing, the CPU utilization, RAM, and some other things as well. I'm gonna hide it for now. And you can log these the performance numbers in case you're running into any issues. For example, if you get frequent FPS drops during gaming, you can log the performance data, and then it'll save the data to a given folder, and you can then read out the data. Again, I don't believe that Nvidia actually has an equivalent to this, so that's also pretty damn cool. And one last thing I wanted to show you is something that unfortunately is also exclusive to Vega cards, and that's HBCC memory segment. So what this does, now the Vega 56 and 64 have 8 gigabytes of HBM2 memory, and the Radeon 7 has 16 gigs of it. So that HBM2 memory is sitting right on the GPU or right next to a GPU core, as opposed to having a separate memory module like other graphics card memory has. So what this allows AMD to do with their software is the HBCC, so the high bandwidth cache controller. For example, let's say you have a Vega 56 like me and you have 8 gigs of VRAM, right? Let's say you're playing something like Battlefield 5 at 4K extreme resolutions, right? then that game might actually demand more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. And so on every other 8 gigabyte card, that might be a problem, and you'd have to lower the settings, or alternatively, you'd have decreased performance or stutterings. With HBCC though, this can allow the card to draw extra memory from the system RAM if it needs it. So for example, the value you see here is the 8 gigabytes of the graphics card's own VRAM, plus the rest is from system RAM. So for example, we're at almost 5 gigabytes of system RAM that it would pull extra. So again, whereas every other 8 gigabyte VRAM card would be actually getting to a point where that becomes a bottleneck in the near future at 4K gaming, this, just enable HBCC and you're fine. So let's get back to our original 3 questions from the beginning of the video. Firstly, how much faster is the Vega 56 in comparison to the GTX 970? Well, on average, we see a 57.4% increase in performance. Keep in mind that we were CPU bottlenecked in 2 games, and one of the other 8 games heavily favors Nvidia. So if we had taken another set of 10 games, then the difference would probably be even bigger. Secondly, which software is better? In my opinion, it's Radeon settings, because it looks cleaner, it's easier to use, and it has more features. So pretty much it wins on all aspects, and especially the Nvidia control panel really looks dated by now. And thirdly, is it worth upgrading to a Vega 56 now if you already have a GTX 970? Well, for one, disclaimer, due to some of the delays in the production of this video, maybe it's not worth upgrading to a Vega 56 now either way, because Navi is launching in next month. But we don't know what Navi is going to perform like, so let's treat this as its own thing in isolation, independently from whether or not Navi is going to be any good. So is it worth upgrading from a 970 to a Vega 56? I'm going to try to look at this with pros and cons, like when is it worth it and when isn't it worth it to upgrade. Let's start with the cons. So I think it's not worth upgrading to the Vega 56 if you only play Fortnite on your PC, because we saw that the GTX 970 actually performs pretty damn well in that game, even on epic quality. If you want higher FPS, you can obviously lower the graphics settings a little bit. And the Vega 56 did provide higher average FPS, but the 970 was more consistent. And as we all know, Fortnite is very well optimized for Nvidia hardware. So if you still want a GPU upgrade to get even better FPS in Fortnite, I would recommend something like the RTX 2060 instead of the Vega 56. Also, if you're a casual gamer that maybe plays a game once a week, maybe twice a week for an hour or two, and you're content with 1080p 60 FPS gaming, well then it's just not worth upgrading from a 970, period. Because in this situation, if 1080p 60 FPS is all you want from your gaming experience, and that's completely legitimate, then sure, you're probably also fine with lowering 1 or 2 graphic settings in order to get to the 60 FPS that you want. And in that case, well, it's not worth upgrading from the 970 to any graphics card, not just to the Vega 56 specifically. So let's go to the pros then. When is it worth the upgrade? Well, firstly, if you want higher refresh rates and higher resolutions, then the Vega 56 does make sense if you're an enthusiast and you have a reasonable budget, but not a ridiculous amount of money for something like a Radeon 7 or let alone a 2080 Ti, then it's absolutely worth grabbing a Vega 56. Also, it's completely worth it if you use your Vega 56 or your graphics card, I should say, for more than just gaming. So, for example, if you do productive workloads on, like as a thing on the side, and you use it for GPU rendering, the Vega 56 is going to absolutely destroy the 970 in those sort of tasks. We've seen a plus 90% performance in Firestrike, and I imagine the difference would be even bigger in something like Blender. And the 8 gigabytes of HBM2 is just so fast. It's so much faster than the memory on the GTX 970. Lastly, it's also worth the upgrade if you want to future-proof yourself. Like, for example, if you're happy with gaming at say 1440p and you want to game on 1440p for the next couple of years, well, then the Vega 56 is certainly a good investment. And since the 970 even struggled in some games at 1080p, 1440p is really going to be a bit of a stretch with the 970. Whereas the Vega should be just fine in most games. And as I said a little bit earlier, it's future-proof because if you ever run out of those 8 gigabytes of memory, then you can just assign more through Radeon settings. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications if you want to be notified whenever I upload something new. And please share this video with your friends or on social media to help this channel grow if you like my content. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.